This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is best-selling author Jim Rickards. His newest book, The Road to Ruin, The Global Elite's Secret Plan for the Next Financial Crisis. I don't think there's any doubt that the topic areas that Jim covers in this book, this is why Trump was elected. The people in the United States of America said, we've had enough. We don't trust what's going on in D.C. We don't trust anything. We are willing to roll the dice and we'll give this guy, Donald Trump, a chance. I have no earthly idea how it will work out with our newest president. I hope for the best. But Jim Rickards makes a strong case for why no matter what, we are all facing tough times in the future. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Jim Rickards. What a fun time to be calling a man who has in his subtitle the phrase global elites, when WikiLeaks has basically proved this concept in spades in the last couple of weeks.
You know, it's funny. I started using the phrase elites in my first book, Currency Wars. A lot of my editors were like, Jim, you got to back off this elite thing. It sounds too spooky. People don't know what you're talking about. And I just felt strongly that it was the right word, and I stayed with it. And we're in the subtitle now, right? Exactly. You turn on the TV, it's like the elites are doing this, the elites are doing that. So it is fun. While
we're on this subject of elites, even though I'm very comfortable using the phrase, and as I said, WikiLeaks is giving me all the ammunition in the world to be comfortable, why don't you lay your perspective out, though? Because it can sound a little conspiracy to people out there, but there really is a group of people that are far and above the average folks, and they're making decisions that affect everyone's lives.
Yes, I think that's exactly right, Michael. When I use the word elite, I take pains in my new book, The Road to Ruin, to explain exactly what I mean. And the first thing I say is it's not a deep, dark conspiracy. These are not hooded figures who look like a board meeting of Spectre in a James Bond movie, although I do mention Spectre and James Bond in the book as a way of making this point. We know who they are. It's Christine Lagarde, it's Mario Draghi, it's Paul Krugman, it's Larry Summers, it's Janet Yellen. In other words, it's a mix of central bankers, finance ministers, academics, other policymakers, and for that matter, you can include the heads of state. There might be 10 names that appear in the media regularly, but it's probably a group of 200 to 300, perhaps more. They get together on a regular basis. You see them at Davos in January. You see them at the Aspen Ideas Festival in the summer. You know, some of them show up at Jackson Hole at the end of August, etc. It's a little bit of a floating group. Not every one of them is at every meeting. Some meetings specialize in finance, central banking, some specialized in defense and so forth. But you can really know who they are. And of course, the mother of all elite groups, Bilderberg. I mentioned this in the book. I briefed the head of Bilderberg once. He was a perfectly nice guy. We met with some of his associates in a closed conference room in Rockefeller Center. I thought the setting was appropriate. He was very interested in the euro at the time, and I assured him that the euro wasn't going anywhere, and he was very relieved to hear that. So my point being, they're real people. We know who they are. It's a little bit of a floating group. You know, membership is permeable. You can be the new up-and-comer. One would certainly put Lael Brainerd in that group today. She's one of the board of governors of the Fed, you know, possibly a future Secretary of the Treasury. Sometimes you get kicked out of the club. Dominic Strauss-Kahn had a little trouble a few years ago, 2011, and had to resign from the head of the IMF. But as I say, it's a definite group. They have a definite agenda. We know who they are. It's not a mystery. What it takes is some acquaintance with some of these organizations I mentioned and where they publish their technical work based on staff work and kind of what their agenda is.
I think the thing that's really interesting about what WikiLeaks is doing right now is all the people you just mentioned, the organizations, for decades, they've had a public face. and a certain contingent of the population of whatever country believes, and they just accept. And let's just say roughly it's 50% of most countries will accept this just verbatim and say, okay, this is the story. But WikiLeaks is showing quite clearly that there is a public and private face, and we are now seeing in writing, perhaps for the very first time, the private face of how these people really operate.
Well, first of all, that's right. We have had a nice look behind the curtain. If an elite is giving a press conference or interacting with reporters, that's one face. But when they're talking to each other, one elite to another in what they believe is a secure email system, that's a very different thing. And that's what we're saying. We're looking behind the curtain. It's interesting in two respects. Number one, partly because of WikiLeaks, but also because of fundamental things: behavior of the economy, stagnation, lack of sufficient jobs, lack of real wage increases, income distribution, skewing all the income to almost all the income to a very small group, and gains in productivity such as they are not being widely spread. For all those reasons, people are losing confidence in the elites. But what is even more, to me, intriguing, because the elites are starting to lose confidence in themselves. And that's interesting because they start to run for cover. I analogize it to a herd of wildebeest and being stalked by a lion, or lioness, actually. The lioness is the failure of their ideas, that free trade is not working the way we were all taught in our first year of economics class. A rising tide does not lift all boats; it lifts some of the boats. Et cetera. Pick your metaphor, pick your cliche, but their ideas are not working. People are catching on to it. WikiLeaks has accelerated that process, but I don't think it started the process. That process was already underway. And what you'll start to see as the economy gets worse, as we move closer, really daily, to the next financial collapse, they'll start to engage in very bad behavior. When I say bad behavior, they'll start to buy gold, stash it away, get their second homes, warm up their private jets, and get ready to run for cover, in other words, and leave the rest of us holding the bag. And you'll start to see more and more of that.
Let's take this back in time. And you had a bird's eye seat, a view in the summer of 1998. And this is 18 years ago. I'm old enough to where 18 years ago feels like, I can still remember that summer of 1998, and I know you can too. For the audience that probably is thinking, well, Mike and Jim, you're going to talk about an event from the summer of 1998. How can that possibly connect to 2016? Jim, why don't you start to lay that through line down? Because I think it's terribly important for people to understand.
Sure. Thanks, Michael. And it is important. And that is the beginning of, it's not the beginning of financial crises or the things I discuss in my book, but it is the beginning of a 3 crises timeline that I lay out in the book pointing to the next crisis. So I talk about 3 financial crises, one in 1998, one 10 years later in 2008, and a third one that's coming 10 years later in 2018. Now, clearly 2018 is an estimate. I'm not putting a hard stake in the ground saying, January 1st, 2018, the world's coming to an end. What I'm saying is that's a reasonable estimate of when financial markets might collapse, but it's very important to realize that it could happen tomorrow. There's nothing set in stone about waiting until 2018. The fact is these financial crises happen every 6, 7, 8 years like clockwork, and it's been 8 years since the last one, so we're pretty much due. It doesn't mean it happens tomorrow at all, but no one should be surprised if it does. But so that anyway, that's my tempo: 1998, 2008, 2018. Now in 1998, the crisis you're referring to, it actually started, interestingly, the year before in June 1997 when Thailand devalued their baht as their local currency. What was happening was that they had a fixed exchange rate to the dollar. Hot money was pouring into Thailand, building hotels, golf courses, resorts, service industry, you name it. And same thing with all of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Korea, etc. Suddenly, people started taking their money out, and the reserves melted away, and the central bank broke the peg. The finance ministry broke the peg. That started a panic. Everybody wanted their money back. And then there was literally blood in the streets in Indonesia and Korea. Started to spread around the world. It cooled off, it calmed down a little bit in that winter of 97, 98, but it came back beginning this spring. And then it hit like a cyclone in August 1998 when Russia defaulted. My firm at the time, Long-Term Capital Management, very large hedge fund, we had $1.3 trillion of derivatives contracts with the rest of Wall Street. We started to hemorrhage. It was pretty clear that we were going to basically hit the wall in a matter of weeks. So Wall Street organized a rescue. I negotiated that rescue package. We got it done at the end of September. The Fed pitched in by cutting rates, cut them again on an emergency basis a couple of weeks later, and the world did not come to an end. But we were hours away from closing every market in the world. That's not an exaggeration. Alan Greenspan, chairman of the Fed, Bob Rubin, Secretary of Treasury, both testified to that effect. I was there. I knew we were trying to get the money to change hands so we could issue a press release with, just hours to go before Tokyo stock market opened, although they might not have opened if we hadn't been able to get it done. That's how close we came. Now, come forward 10 years to 2008. Same thing. We were days away, if not hours, from the sequential collapse of every major bank in the world. Bear Stearns had failed in March 2008. Fannie and Freddie failed in June, July 2008. Lehman failed in September 2008. They were falling like dominoes. We were days away from Morgan Stanley failing. Then it would have been Goldman, then Citibank, then Bank of America, then JP Morgan would have been the last domino. That process was truncated by Federal Reserve intervention. Fed did some extraordinary things. Of course, over time, they increased their balance sheet to $4 trillion, but immediately they printed $10 trillion and swapped that money with the European Central Bank. What was going on there, Michael, was that European banks had made loans in dollars, which meant that they had to borrow dollars to fund them. A lot of those borrowings came from U.S. money market funds. Americans were panicked. They were pulling their money out of the money market funds, so the money market funds couldn't roll over the short-term commercial paper and bank CDs that the Europeans relied on. So, of course, those banks turned to their central bank, the European Central Bank, as the lender of last resort. But the European Central Bank cannot print dollars. It can only print euros. So where were they going to get the dollars to bail out their own banks? So what happened was European Central Bank printed up trillions of euros. Federal Reserve printed up trillions of dollars. They swapped them so that the European Central Bank could get dollars from the Fed and bail out their own banking system. They did a lot else besides. In conjunction with the FDIC, they guaranteed every bank deposit in America, regardless of insurance. There was insurance, FDIC insurance up to $250,000. They took off the cap and said no limit. So if you were a small, medium-sized enterprise that happened to have $1 million in the bank that day for whatever working capital, that was all guaranteed. They guaranteed every money market fund in America, on and on and on. Well, it worked in the sense that we didn't have a complete collapse I'm talking about, which actually I think would have been very healthy because we could have cleaned out the rot, reformed the banking system. There was a lot else we could have done that was not done at the time. These kinds of collapses are exactly like natural disasters, certain ones like earthquakes and volcanoes and forest fires, etc. The difference is that in a natural system, like a seismic system, like an earthquake, you cannot stop the process. When an earthquake begins, you can't stop it. It has to run its course. But when a financial earthquake begins, you can stop it with policy, but all you do is build up that energy for the next time. So imagine, hypothetically, you could stop an earthquake in the middle, which you can't do, but let's imagine you could. What is an earthquake? An earthquake is a release of energy that's built up. If you stopped it, the energy wouldn't go away. It would just build up for the next time. That's what happens in a financial panic. When you intervene with policy and truncate the process, you don't solve a problem. You just build up the energy for the next time and make it even more unstable. Now, come forward to 2018. We're getting ready for the next financial crisis. But here's an important distinction. So in 1998, Wall Street bailed out a hedge fund. In 2008, the central banks bailed out Wall Street. Who's going to bail out the central banks in 2018? In other words, each crisis is bigger than the one before. Each bailout is bigger than the one before. We're now at the point where the central banks themselves are going to need to be bailed out. Just to illustrate that, so I said that the Federal Reserve, the U.S. Central Bank, took its balance sheet from $800 billion to $4 trillion, which they did. And they lowered interest rates to zero. They're just slightly above that right now. If somehow the Fed had normalized, if over the past 4 years, after the crisis was over, they had got the balance sheet back down to $800 billion or maybe $1 trillion and got interest rates up to, 2.5%, some not too high number, I'd be the first one to congratulate them. I would say, nice job, guys. You saved the world. You got your balance sheet back to normal. You got interest rates back to normal, and you're ready for the next one. But that didn't happen. The balance sheet is still up there at $4 trillion. Interest rates are still down there close to zero. they don't have any capacity to deal with the next crisis. I mean, what are they going to do? Go to $8 trillion, $12 trillion, et cetera? They can't. They're at some invisible boundary. You won't know until you cross it, where they destroy confidence in their own sort of core product, which is the U.S. dollar. The next bailout won't come from the central banks. It can't, because they're tapped out. It will come from the only clean balance sheet left in the world, which is the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. Let me just illustrate, the Fed is leveraged 113 to 1 right now. It looks like a really bad hedge fund. The IMF is only leveraged about 3 to 1. So they have scope, they have space to expand their balance sheet. They also print money. The Federal Reserve has a printing press. They print dollars. The European Central Bank has a printing press. They print euros. Well, the IMF has a printing press also. They can print special drawing rights, so-called SDRs. It's a geeky name, but just think of it as world money, because that's what it is. So they will flood the zone with 10 trillion SDRs, maybe $15 trillion worth of SDRs to reliquify the world, which will be highly inflationary. But it'll also be the end of the dollar as the benchmark global reserve currency. You'll still have dollars, by the way. I'm not saying we won't have dollars in our pockets, but it'll be a local currency. If I go to Turkey, I get some Turkish lira. If I go to Mexico, I get some Mexican pesos. Well, if you come to the United States in the future, you'll get some dollars as a local currency, but it won't be the global benchmark. That'll be the SDR.
A couple points I want to add. You don't have to comment, but just for color for the audience, those buildings in Bangkok, those 80-story buildings never finished from 1997, 1998, they're still there like eerie monuments. And also in your text, in your new work, I'm not going to give it away, but you have a great story about potentially hiring Goldman Sachs in the summer of 98 for financing and what Goldman Sachs did with information. Kind of a tangent, but people should really go read your book just to find that out. Where I want to take you with right now, though, is there's a foundation for how this is all unfolding. And you cover this, and it's not something we can cover in just even 30, 40 minutes, but it would take much longer time. But, there's this preference by so many people for certainty over uncertainty. And you contrast nicely in your work Bayesian statistics with the efficient market theory. For some people out there, that's going to sound wonky. Why don't you go ahead, Jim, put your best professor hat on and contrast the efficient market theory with perhaps Bayesian statistics and let people really understand what's going on.
Sure. And, I do this in the book, Michael, but what I try to do, and I think it works, is just put it in plain English. So I never dumb down the subject, but I do use plain English, metaphors, stories, ways of explaining it to people that you don't need a PhD in statistics to follow it. And it's very important that you do follow it, that you understand what the flaws in the system are. So basically there are two major schools of statistics. It means, statistical science is a broad science, and there are lots of techniques. We don't need to get in the weeds on those. But one is called the frequentist school. The frequentist school says it comes from the name frequent, obviously, but it says, give me lots and lots and lots of data. So you'll sit there and give me lots of data. The more data, the better. And I'll take that data and I'll take historical time series and I'll go back and look at correlations, and I'll do regressions, and I'll compute the degree of the correlation called the R-squared, and I'll assume that the future looks like the past, and once I've figured out the past with all this data, I can predict the future. So that's frequentist statistics. And by the way, that is what central banks use. That is what Janet Yellen uses. She was a professor at Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, which is probably the leading school of this kind of statistical method. But there's another statistical method, applied mathematical method, that you use when you don't have enough data. And I learned this at the CIA. We were in the aftermath of 9/11 trying to figure out the next attack. Well, we had one attack to deal with. We didn't have 1,000 attacks. We had one, 9/11. So what could we learn from that? What inferences could we draw from the behavior of terrorists, from certain market signals we had, particularly the insider trading ahead of 9/11? That's non-debatable. The evidence for that is overwhelming. I talked about that in my last book, The Death of Money, but there was clearly insider trading ahead of 9/11. Could we look for it? Could we find it? Could we see a terrorist attack coming, et cetera? We had to do all that modeling. We were using mathematical models. Now, here's the point. We couldn't sit there and wait for 10 more attacks. So we're supposed to be, frequentist statisticians and wait for 10 more attacks, or 30,000 people are dead, and now we have a database. Now we have 10 attacks. Now we can figure it out. That's what frequentists do. We had to use Bayes' theorem, and what that says is you sort of go to war with the data you have, to paraphrase Don Rumsfeld. You take the data you have, which may not be very much, maybe none. You use inference, behavioral psychology, history, and you form an estimate of the event that you're trying to understand. And if you have no data at all, you give it 50-50. Just say, I kind of really don't know, but I'll say 50-50. But then what you do is you update the hypothesis as new data comes in. So every new data point goes into the equation in such a way that you ask yourself a question: what is the likelihood that this would happen if my hypothesis were true? Or what is the likelihood this would happen if my hypothesis is not true? In other words, the probability of A conditional upon B. That's the kind of formal mathematical way of stating it. But the point is, it lets you do very good math and very good science without very much data. Now, the Janet Yellen type statisticians hate this because you have to start with the smart guess. But my answer is, well, what if that's all you have? What if you're trying to crack the Enigma code and stop Nazi submarines from, defeating the British Empire? What if you're trying to solve the next 9/11? What if you're trying to locate a missing Malaysian airliner where there's no evidence at all? This is what you do. And so all I've done, Michael, is I've taken this technique from the intelligence world, brought it over into capital markets where it is not used very much, if at all, and getting very good results with it, very good forecasting results in, gold, bonds, major market indices, etc. Talk a little bit about Bayesian statistics, but as I say, do it in plain English. You don't have to master the equation. The equation's in the book. You can find it there, but you don't have to master that equation. You just have to follow the story about how we do things to see why central bankers are always getting the wrong results. So I like to say, it doesn't matter how smart you are. If you have the wrong model, you're going to get the wrong results every time.
It also gives a way for explaining how things are connected, doesn't it?
Well, that's it. Yes, it does. That's also a different branch of science that I also use called complexity theory. And that's the point I make. It's not, Bayes' theorem, which we just talked about, is very powerful, applied mathematics, but it's not the only science that I use, and it's not the only science that's discussed in the book. Complexity theory is another one, which has sort of cousins in network theory and graph theory and other branches of physics and applied mathematics. But what it basically does is it understands the world as a complex dynamic system. And just to kind of illustrate that a little bit, imagine you're trying to heat something up. So it's cold and you want to heat it up. You can think of your house and the thermostat in your house, and the house is too cold. You take the thermostat and you dial it up. The house is too warm. You take the thermostat and you dial it down. That's a linear system. If you move the thermostat a little, the heat goes up a little, and so forth, one-to-one correspondence. It's reversible. If I make it too hot, I can cool it down a little bit, etc. Now imagine a nuclear reactor. Core of a nuclear reactor, there's chain reactions going on at the neutron level, are an example of a complex dynamic system. It's deterministic in one sense, but you can't actually get down. You can't get that granular to say, well, this neutron is going to release this electron, etc. It's not. You can understand that theoretically. You can observe it at a certain macro level, but you can't see every single atom doing every single thing. You can just understand it. Well, you can dial a nuclear reactor up and down just like a thermostat, but you better get it right, because you're not playing with a linear reversible system. You're playing with a complex dynamic system. And if you get it wrong, you're going to melt down the reactor, and it's irreversible. There's no such thing as a melt up. You can melt something down and release radiation and kill a lot of people, but you can't melt it up. Here's my concern. The Fed thinks they're playing with a thermostat, but they're actually playing with a nuclear reactor. They think they're playing with an equilibrium system that's reversible, that they understand you can tweak a little bit and get the right result, just have to wait, etc. But they're fiddling with the dials of a nuclear reactor, and they're going to melt down the entire financial system and not know what happened, not see it coming, and not be able to fix it.
That really sums it up, doesn't it?
Well, as I say, it's I could run through the equations, but the description I just gave is a pretty good synopsis of the science. I do put a lot of illustrations, and there's a little bit of math in the book, but I hope the readers enjoy it. But they don't have to, stop cold and solve the equations. They can. It's there for those who are interested. And the book has 151 footnotes in a 300-page book, or endnotes rather. And the point I make, Michael, is I do not like to make claims without giving the backup. There are lots of people around, on podcasts and interviews and blogs and TV. You see them all the time, and they'll say, "Oh, the world's coming to an end. The system's going to collapse. Gold's going here. Stocks are going to fall, etc." I might even agree with some of that, but if you don't give me the analysis, if you don't back up what you're saying, I don't have particularly high regard for people who are kind of running around saying that. I'll make a claim, but what I like to do is back it up. I'll give you history. I'll give you math. I'll give you science. I'll give you an explanation. I'll put it in plain English. Don't debate the claims. Debate the science. In other words, if there's two people, I'll just pick out two guys, good guys. I've met both of them, Peter Schiff and Harry Dent. So Peter says gold's going to, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think he'd be comfortable saying $5,000 an ounce or higher. Harry Dent says, oh no, it's going to $800 an ounce. Well, what's the point of debating those claims? It doesn't get you anywhere. It's like saying who's better, guitar player, Jimmy Page or Jimi Hendrix. These are pointless debates. You have to get down into the specific dynamics, and that's what I do. I'll say, I happen to agree that gold's going a lot higher, but I understand what Harry Dent is saying. Harry Dent's talking about deflation. I've debated Harry, and I said, look, there are very powerful deflationary trends in the economy. You're right about that. And left to its own devices, gold might go down to that level, but what you're missing is that central banks cannot have deflation because it increases the real burden of debt, it destroys tax collections, it destroys banks. It does a whole lot of bad things to the elite agenda, and therefore they're not going to let it happen, even though the world wants to move in that direction. That's kind of the second derivative. A lot of times when I debate, first thing I'll say is, everything you say is right, but here's what you're missing, and then boom, 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 and then kind of go down that list. So, I have claims and forecasts just like anyone else, but I back it up with a lot of analysis, and you get a lot of compliments from the readers. They just say, thank you, and they may or may not agree, and that's fine. There's plenty of room for disagreement, but they feel that even if they don't agree, you had a chance to shine a light on something and really explain how it works.
Jim, one more topic area that I want to go into, slightly perhaps outside the system. I think he would think of himself as an elite. I have read in many places that he might be the wealthiest man in the world, and that would be the head of Russia, the president of Russia. What in the world is going on in the last 6 months, last 9 months? I know it's partly U.S. election politics, but my gosh, how did we go to a situation where all of a sudden, like openly, in discussions everywhere, nuclear war with Russia? This seems extremely unusual. Is there anything to this, or is this just all politics?
No, actually, I think that World War III has already begun. And it's begun between Russia and the United States. It's just being carried out in non-kinetic fashion, meaning it's basically cyber financial warfare, which is extremely threatening to people's wealth and savings. Now, there's a claim. Let me back that up a little bit. We're looking at a massive failure of U.S. foreign policy going back at least as far as Nixon, but you could say even to Bismarck in the late 19th century. The key to U.S. foreign policy has been to keep China and Russia separated. Now, there's sometimes when we're friends with Russia, sometimes when we're friends with China, but you have to keep those two powers separated. They're, along with the United States, they're the three most powerful countries on earth, regardless of economic development, just in terms of landmass, nuclear weapons, the size of their armies, hegemonic ambitions, regional ambitions, etc. They're the big three. And so if you're the United States, you always want to separate them. In other words, be friends with one and be adversarial to the other, but then, change it up now and then, as Nixon did with China. We also had openings to Russia from time to time. For the first time in the history of American foreign policy since the end of World War II, we have allowed Russia and China to hold hands. We haven't kept them separate. They've sort of joined forces against us. Now we're the odd man out. The United States is the odd man out. The United States is the one facing two bullies. When you're one of the kids on the playground and there's a tough guy around, you want him to be your friend so you can fend off the bully. But now the two bullies have got together and we're vulnerable. So this has emboldened Russia. Putin feels that China has his back. He can confront the United States. Imagine if he were confronting China, he wouldn't be quite so, ambitious, if you will, in the region. And U.S. power has been withdrawing from around the world, from not just the Middle East, which is obvious, but also Central Asia and elsewhere. So Putin feels that he's got a free hand to expand to the borders of the old Soviet Empire, which is really the Russian Empire, is more than Russia itself, and Russia has been invaded so many times. They always want the countries around them under their control, so they have a buffer zone before you get to Mother Russia. Now, I don't think any of what I just described is very well understood by President Obama and the White House staff. They are focused on other things. Let's just put it that way. The other thing that Russia is doing, they see the end of the dollar. We talked about that a little bit earlier in the interview with the rise of the SDR and the role of the IMF in the next financial crisis. He sees that. He's buying he's bought 1,000 tons of gold in the last 8 years, more than doubled, almost tripled the Russian gold reserves. Russia bought 20 tons of gold in September. That's the most recent month for which we have data. We'll see what they did in October. So they're getting as much gold as they can. Of course, China's doing the same thing. I'm sitting here watching Russia and China hold hands, buy gold by the thousands of tons, and it's very obvious what's going on. They're preparing for a post-dollar world. Unfortunately, U.S. investors are kind of locked into the dollar system and haven't quite figured this out yet. The other thing that's going on, Vladimir Putin has a 6,000-person cyber brigade. These are not criminal gangs of hackers. This is Russian military and intelligence assets working day and night to penetrate every operating system, every financial system, and with a lot of success. I mean, I don't know if you've noticed, Michael, maybe and your readers and our listeners today, but you notice how the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ, every now and then there's like a half-day shutdown or a 2-hour shutdown, or same thing happened in Australia recently, or, Delta Airlines goes offline or United Airlines goes offline. These things are happening more and more frequently. Well, these are likely Russian or perhaps Chinese or Iranian or South Korean or Syrian. There's actually the Syrian electronic army out there. Penetrations. They're probing. They don't want to turn off the lights, but they're testing it for the day that they do. Cyber warfare is penetrating these systems, getting control of critical infrastructure. So, for example, you get into the operating system of a dam, a major dam like the Grand Coulee Dam or the Hoover Dam, etc., and you open the floodgates, and you can kill hundreds of thousands of people in their sleep just by flooding them and drowning them when they don't suspect it. Financial warfare, that's something I did in 2009 with the Pentagon. We did the first financial war game. Now imagine combining the two. Combining cyber warfare and financial warfare into cyber financial warfare, where you get inside the operating system of a major stock market and you don't shut it down. That's easy. It's child's play to shut down the stock exchange. But you start spoofing the orders, putting in orders, sell Amazon, sell Google, sell Tesla, sell all these stocks, and the specialists and the market makers are sitting there executing the orders because they don't know that somebody just took control of Morgan Stanley's order entry system or Goldman Sachs's order entry system, and they're treating them like normal orders. By the way, this happened not too long ago with night trading. I don't know if you remember that disaster where the night trading computers went crazy. I'm not saying that was a Russian hack. It looks like that was an internal failure, but their order entry system started sending out all these orders to execute, and they were all getting filled. Nobody could find the kill switch. They were running around night trading saying, hey, shut it off, shut it off, shut it off. But they couldn't find the kill switch. And the firm lost $450 million in a few hours and basically had to be taken over and bailed out and almost went bankrupt. That's what you can do. And by the way, none of this is fantasy. None of this is futuristic. It's happening now. In 2010, the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, found a Russian attack virus in the operating system of the NASDAQ stock market. It was disabled, but how many more are in there that we haven't found, et cetera. I run into billionaires and I say, what do you own? And they'll say, oh, I've got stocks, I've got bonds, I've got this, I've got that. And I say, no, you don't. You've got electrons. They can be wiped out. They can disappear. Good luck reestablishing. If your wealth is in electronic form, you're vulnerable to everything I just described. So I don't know how people sleep at night without some, physical, tangible assets that are non-hackable, non-erasable, such as, obviously gold, silver, fine art, land, natural resources, even private equity, where it's a written contract with an entrepreneur. Maybe you can get on your bicycle and go down, knock on the guy's door and find him. I mean, my point being, there's a lot of wealth outside the digital accounting system that you can have. And if you don't have some of that, you're vulnerable to being completely wiped out.
Jim, you are prolific. I don't know how you are cranking these books out. I have to tell you, you are seriously dedicated on that front. The newest book, The Road to Ruin, The Global Elite's Secret Plan for the Next Financial Crisis. Ominous, but recommended because there's a lot of depth there. There's a narrative and a connective tissue that people probably aren't going to expect.
Michael, thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And again, the book's available for pre-sale on Amazon, Barnes & Noble right now, and I hope people enjoy it.
Jim, is there any other website we can send people to?
My own website, jamesrickardsproject.com. So that's all one word, jamesrickardsproject.com. You can order the books there. For those who are interested, you can actually get an autographed copy of the book. We have, you can click on Amazon, order the book. I say Amazon, also Barnes & Noble. We have a link for independent booksellers, whatever people prefer. And then once you put your order in, take that confirmation number, paste it into our website, and you'll get a free book plate autographed by me. I sign them all personally. There's no robo-signers. I just got back from Australia. I signed 600 of them on the plane. So you get a real autograph. You can stick it inside the book if you like. So autographed copies are available right now at jamesrickardsproject.com.
Jim, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Michael.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.